My hands trembled as I clutched the straps of my backpack, standing frozen at the threshold of Mrs. Peterson's 8th grade classroom. The familiar knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach, the same one that formed every year on the first day of school. The room buzzed with the chaotic energy of 24 students reuniting after summer break, their voices creating a symphony of excitement that made my own silence feel even heavier. "You can do this, Adaize," I whispered to myself, repeating the morning pep talk my grandfather had given me. "Your name means King's daughter. Remember who you are." I slipped into an empty desk in the second row, making myself as small as possible. Around me, other kids chatted about summer adventures, new sneakers, and growth spurts. No one seemed to notice me, which was exactly how I preferred it. Every year was the same. I'd enter a new classroom, the teacher would stumble over my name during roll call, and I'd become that girl with the weird name before I could even introduce myself properly. The clock ticked toward 8:30, and Mrs. Peterson, a tall white woman with auburn hair pulled into a tight bun, closed the classroom door with a definitive click. "Good morning, class! Welcome to 8th grade," she announced, her voice carrying an artificial cheeriness that didn't quite reach her eyes. She wore a floral dress that seemed to contradict her rigid posture and the stern set of her mouth. "I'm Mrs. Peterson, and I'll be your homeroom teacher this year. Let's start with roll call so I can begin learning your names." My heart began its familiar acceleration as she picked up her clipboard. The fluorescent light suddenly seemed too bright, too exposing. I slouched further in my seat. "Jason Adams? Here. Brittany Cardwell? Present." The list continued alphabetically, which meant my name would come early. I rehearsed the pronunciation in my head. Adaize. 4 simple syllables that somehow became an insurmountable obstacle for most Americans. Adaz. Adezi. Mrs. Peterson paused, frowning at her paper. I could feel every eye in the classroom turn toward me as the silence stretched uncomfortably. I raised my hand slightly. "It's Adaize Okafor," I said, pronouncing it clearly. "Adaize Okafor." Mrs. Peterson's eyebrows arched higher. "My goodness, that's quite a mouthful, isn't it?" A few students snickered. "Don't you have a nickname? Something easier?" The question hung in the air like a physical thing. My cheeks burned with humiliation as I shook my head. "No, ma'am. Just Adaize." She sighed, a sound that contained both impatience and dismissal. "Well, maybe we should give you one. How about Ada? That's much simpler." She didn't wait for my response before making a note on her clipboard and moving on to the next name. Danielle Okonkwo. 2 desks behind me, a boy with a voice deeper than expected for our age responded, "Here." I felt a flash of irritation noticing that she'd pronounced his last name correctly, without hesitation. The irony wasn't lost on me. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of syllabi reviews and classroom procedures. During math, Mrs. Peterson called on me twice, addressing me as Ada both times. I didn't correct her. What was the point? By lunch, 3 classmates had already adopted the nickname, as if Mrs. Peterson had given them all permission to rename me. "Hey, Ada, are you sitting with anyone?" a girl named Maria asked as we entered the cafeteria. She was being friendly, I knew, but hearing that truncated version of my name from yet another person made something inside me wither. "I'm not hungry," I lied, turning away from the lunch line and heading toward the library instead. I needed a place where no one would call me anything at all. The school library was mercifully quiet, with only the librarian, Ms. Harper, organizing books on a distant shelf. I found a corner table hidden behind the reference section and slumped into a chair. My hunger pangs were easier to bear than the continuous erosion of my identity. I pulled out my journal, a leather-bound book my grandfather had given me for my 13th birthday, and began writing. Today I disappeared again. Mrs. Peterson decided my name was too difficult, so she cut it in half like it meant nothing, like my grandfather's choice, my father's honor, my entire history could be condensed into something more convenient for her tongue. I wonder if she knows what Ades means. I wonder if she would care. I must have been writing longer than I realized because suddenly the bell signaling the end of lunch period startled me. I closed my journal and reluctantly made my way back to class, where the afternoon crawled by in painful slowness. Every time Mrs. Peterson called me Ada, I felt a small piece of myself fade away. By dismissal, I was exhausted from the effort of existing in a space that seemed determined to erase me. The walk home that afternoon was longer than usual, my feet dragging with each step. Our house was only 12 blocks from school, but it felt like miles as I approached our modest 2-story home with its well-tended garden, my grandfather's pride. I tried to compose myself. Inside was the only place where my name was pronounced correctly, with love and respect. I couldn't bring my school troubles through that door. But as soon as I saw my grandfather sitting in his favorite armchair, surrounded by his books and papers, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, my resolution crumbled. Kofi Okafor had raised me since I was 4 years old after my parents died in a car accident. He was a professor of African history at the local community college, a tall man with dark skin that had grown ashen with age, and eyes that held the weight of countless stories. "Ades," he said, his face lighting up at the sight of me. Just hearing my name pronounced properly sent tears springing to my eyes. "What is wrong, my child?" I dropped my backpack and collapsed into the chair opposite him. "Grandpa, why did you give me such a hard name?" The question came out more accusatory than I'd intended. His eyebrows rose. "Hard? There's nothing hard about your name, Ades. It is just unfamiliar to some ears." He removed his glasses and leaned forward. "Tell me what happened." The story spilled out of me in a rush. Mrs. Peterson's dismissal, the snickering classmates, the immediate adoption of Ada, as if my full name was too much trouble to bother with. As I spoke, my grandfather's expression darkened, the lines around his mouth deepening. "She had no right," he said quietly when I finished. "No right at all." I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. "Maybe she's right, though. Maybe it would be easier if I just went by Ada, or picked something American like, I don't know, Amy or something." "Easier for whom?" My grandfather's voice carried a rare edge. "For those too lazy to learn 4 syllables? For those who would have you erase your heritage to make their lives more convenient?" He shook his head firmly. "No, Ades. Your name is not a burden to be lightened. It is a gift to be treasured." He stood up and went to the bookshelf, pulling down a thick, leather-bound volume I recognized as one of his research journals. "Do you know why I named you Ades?" I nodded. "Because it means king's daughter." "Yes, but there is more to it than that." He sat back down, opening the journal to reveal pages of his neat handwriting. "Your father, my son, asked me to name you before he died. He wanted you to have a name that would remind you of your royal heritage, not from wealth or titles, but from character and dignity. Ades connects you to ancestors who survived the unimaginable and still retained their humanity. It honors the grandmother who walked across 3 countries to escape war, and the great-grandfather who built schools when he could not read himself." I listened, mesmerized as always by my grandfather's storytelling, feeling the weight of my name grow heavier and more precious with each word. When someone asks you to change your name for their convenience, he continued, they are asking you to disconnect from all of that, to make yourself smaller. And that, Maya Daisy, is something we must never do. We sat in silence for a moment, the house quiet except for the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel, another family heirloom with its own story. So what do I do tomorrow? I finally asked. She's already decided to call me Ada. My grandfather closed his journal and placed it on the side table. Tomorrow, he said with a certainty that gave me comfort, we will teach Mrs. Peterson the importance of names. The next morning I woke with a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. My grandfather was already dressed in his best suit, the one he wore for guest lectures and academic conferences. Over breakfast he outlined his plan. I've called the school and requested a meeting with your teacher before classes begin, he explained, adjusting his bow tie. The principal has agreed to allow me 5 minutes at the start of homeroom to address the class. Address the class? I nearly choked on my toast. About what? About the power of names and identity. His eyes twinkled with determination. Do not worry, Adas. I will be respectful, but firm. Sometimes education is needed beyond textbooks. We arrived at school, 30 minutes before the first bell. My grandfather, with his imposing height and dignified bearing, drew curious looks as we made our way to the principal's office. Dr. Martinez, a woman I'd only seen at assemblies, greeted us warmly. Professor Okafor, it's an honor to meet you. I've read your work on colonial impacts on tribal identities. She shook, his hand enthusiastically. And you must be Adais. She pronounced my name perfectly, causing me to blink in surprise. I understand there was some confusion yesterday about your name. My grandfather nodded. A teachable moment, I believe. One we hope to address this morning with your permission. Of course. Mrs. Peterson has been notified of your visit. She should be in her classroom now. As we walked toward room 208, my grandfather placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. Remember, Adaisi, there is no shame in correction when it comes to your identity. Hold your head high. Mrs. Peterson was writing on the whiteboard when we entered, her back to the door. When she turned and saw us, her smile faltered slightly. Good morning, she said, her eyes moving between my grandfather and me. You must be Ada's grandfather. I'm Mrs. Peterson. Professor Kofi Okafor, my grandfather replied, extending his hand. And this is my granddaughter, Adais. He pronounced my name with deliberate clarity. Mrs. Peterson's smile tightened. Yes, of course. Ada mentioned her name was a bit challenging, so we simplified it for classroom use. I believe there has been a misunderstanding, my grandfather said gently. Adaz did not request a simplification of her name. In fact, I understand she provided the correct pronunciation. A flush crept up Mrs. Peterson's neck. Well, yes, but in a classroom of 25 students, efficiency is important. Nicknames are quite common. Nicknames freely chosen are indeed common, my grandfather agreed. Names imposed without consent are something else entirely. The first bell rang, interrupting their conversation. Students began filtering into the classroom, their curious gazes landing on my grandfather and lingering on his formal attire. I slipped into my seat, hyper-aware of the unusual situation unfolding. When the final bell rang, Mrs. Peterson cleared her throat. Class, before we begin today, we have a guest speaker. This is Professor Okafor, who would like to say a few words. My grandfather moved to the front of the room with the ease of someone accustomed to addressing audiences. His presence commanded attention without demanding it. "Good morning, young scholars," he began, his accented voice rich and warm. "I am Professor Kofi Okafor, and I teach African history at Westlake Community College. I am also the grandfather of your classmate, Adais Okafor." He wrote my name on the board in large, clear letters. "I understand that yesterday there was some difficulty with this name. That difficulty presents us with an opportunity to learn something valuable about names and identity." The classroom was utterly silent, every student rapt with attention. Even Mrs. Peterson, standing stiffly by her desk, seemed unable to look away. "Names are more than convenient labels," my grandfather continued. "They are carriers of history, vessels of meaning, bridges between generations. When we make the effort to pronounce someone's name correctly, we are acknowledging their full humanity and the cultures that shaped them." He turned to the class. "How many of you have ever had your name mispronounced?" Nearly every hand went up, including some I didn't expect, like Jason Adams and Brittany Cardwell. "And how did that make you feel?" "Weird," offered one student. "Like I didn't matter," said another. "Embarrassed," added a third. My grandfather nodded. "Yes, exactly. Now imagine being told your name is too difficult, too foreign, too inconvenient, and that you should answer to something else entirely." He walked slowly across the front of the classroom. "The name Adais means king's daughter. It connects my granddaughter to her heritage, to her father who is no longer with us, to a lineage of strength and dignity that stretches back countless generations." Mrs. Peterson shifted uncomfortably. "Let us practice together," my grandfather suggested. "Adaheze," he pronounced each syllable distinctly, inviting the class to repeat after him. To my amazement, they did. Once, twice, 3 times, until the sound of my true name filled the classroom like music. Even Mrs. Peterson joined in, her voice quieter than the others, but present nonetheless. "Excellent," my grandfather beamed. "You see? Not so difficult after all. Just unfamiliar at first, like many worthwhile things in life." He turned to Mrs. Peterson. "Thank you for allowing me these few minutes. I believe our children learn as much from how we treat them as from what we teach them." With that, he nodded respectfully and moved toward the door. Before leaving, he paused beside my desk and placed his hand briefly on my shoulder, a silent gesture of support that filled me with courage. After he left, the classroom remained quiet. Mrs. Peterson cleared her throat twice before finding her voice. "Thank you for that. Illuminating presentation, Professor Okafor." She turned to the class, her composure somewhat recovered. "Let's begin our day with the reading assignment from yesterday." But before she could continue, I felt something rising within me, a sudden, unstoppable need to speak. I raised my hand. "Yes, Ada. I mean Ada Ease." Mrs. Peterson corrected herself. I stood up, my heart hammering so hard, I was certain everyone could hear it. "I'd like to say something, if that's okay." Mrs. Peterson hesitated, then nodded. "Go ahead." I looked around at my classmates, at their curious faces turned toward me. Some I'd known since elementary school. Others were as new to me as I was to them. But in that moment, I felt connected to all of them by the simple truth I needed to share. "Yesterday," I began, my voice surprisingly steady, "when you decided my name was too complicated and called me Ada instead, it felt like you were erasing a part of me, Like who I really am was too inconvenient to bother with. The classroom was so quiet I could hear the wall clock ticking. My parents died when I was 4 years old. My name is one of the few things I have from them. Every time someone says it correctly, it's like they're still here somehow. My voice wavered slightly, but I pressed on. I know it might take practice to say it right. I know it's different from names you're used to, but it's mine, and it matters to me. I looked directly at Mrs. Peterson, whose expression had softened into something I couldn't quite read. I'll help you pronounce it as many times as you need. I'll be patient, but please don't ask me to be someone else just because it's easier. The silence that followed felt electric. Then from the back of the room, Daniel Okonkwo spoke up. I know how you feel. People butcher my last name all the time, but Mrs. Peterson got it right yesterday. He looked at our teacher. How come you could pronounce my name but not hers? Mrs. Peterson's face flushed. I suppose I'm more familiar with your name, Daniel. But that's the point, I said, finding new confidence. You won't become familiar with my name unless you try, unless you decide it's worth the effort. Several other students nodded in agreement. Maria, who had invited me to lunch the day before, raised her hand. My real name is Maria Guadalupe, she said. But in first grade, a teacher told me it was too long, so I've just gone by Maria ever since. I kind of wish I hadn't let that happen. One by one, other students shared similar stories of names shortened, Americanized, or mangled beyond recognition, of small surrenders that had gradually become permanent alterations to their identities. The conversation expanded beyond names to other aspects of culture and heritage that had been minimized or dismissed for convenience's sake. Mrs. Peterson listened, her initial defensiveness giving way to something that looked remarkably like genuine reflection. When the impromptu sharing session finally wound down, she moved to stand beside my desk. "Adize," she said, pronouncing my name carefully and correctly. "And everyone, thank you for your honesty. I made a mistake yesterday. In trying to simplify, I ended up diminishing something precious." She looked around the classroom. As teachers, we're supposed to expand minds, not contract them for convenience. I apologize, and I promise to do better. The sincerity in her voice surprised me. I hadn't expected an apology, much less a public one. "Thank you," I said softly. "Now," Mrs. Peterson continued, addressing the whole class, "I think we've just had a more valuable lesson than anything in our textbooks today. But we do need to move on to our regular curriculum." She smiled, a real smile this time, not the artificial one from yesterday. "After I correct my roll sheet, that is." The rest of the day unfolded with a noticeably different energy. Mrs. Peterson called me Adize each time she addressed me, and though she occasionally stumbled over the pronunciation, the important thing was that she tried. My classmates, too, made efforts to say my name correctly, some even asking me to repeat it until they got it right. By the time the dismissal bell rang, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced on a first day of school in years. As I gathered my books, Mrs. Peterson approached my desk. "Adize, would you stay for a moment?" I nodded, unsure what to expect. Once the other students had filed out, she pulled up a chair next to my desk. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for having the courage to speak up today. It would have been easier to stay silent." "My grandfather always says that silence solves nothing," I replied. "He's a wise man, your grandfather." She paused, seeming to choose her next words carefully. "You know, When I was about your age, I had a different experience with names. My last name wasn't Peterson then. It was Pietrzakowski. Polish. No one could pronounce it, so when I became a teacher, I changed it legally to Peterson. I thought it would make things easier. I studied her face, seeing it in a new light. Did it? Easier, yes, she admitted. But there were costs I didn't anticipate. Every time I sign my name, I'm reminded of what I gave up. She shook her head slightly. That's no excuse for what I did yesterday, but perhaps it explains it somewhat. Sometimes we project our own choices onto others. I understand, I said, and surprisingly, I did. But it's still your choice to make, not someone else's to make for you. Exactly. She smiled. You're very wise for 13. Adazi Okafor. 14 next month. I corrected her, returning the smile. Well, I look forward to celebrating that with you, and to learning much more from each other this year. Walking home that afternoon, I felt taller somehow, as if standing up for... My name had literally helped me grow. My grandfather was waiting on the porch, a book open in his lap, but his eyes on the street, watching for me. Adaise, he called as I approached, the name like a blessing on his lips. How was your day? I climbed the steps and sat beside him, telling him everything. The way the class had practiced my name, the stories others had shared, Mrs. Peterson's surprising apology and revelation. She chose to change her name. I finished. I'm not sure how I feel about that. My grandfather considered this. There is no single right path when it comes to names and identity, he said finally. What matters is that the choice is made freely, not imposed. Your Mrs. Peterson made her choice. Perhaps one day she will make a different one. But today, she chose to honor your choice, and that is progress. I leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him. Thank you for coming to school today, Grandpa. I will always stand with you, Adaise, always. That evening, I wrote in my journal again. Today, I became visible again, not just to others, but to myself. My name is Adaise Okafor, and it is not too much to ask that the world make room for all 4 syllables of who I am. 15 years later, I still think about that day often. It marked a turning point in how I navigated spaces that weren't designed with me in mind. Throughout high school, college, and now in my career, as an elementary school teacher, I've carried the lesson of that 8th grade classroom with me. That the seemingly small act of insisting on your full identity can be revolutionary. I'm particularly careful with my students' names, making sure to learn each one properly, regardless of its origin or complexity. I've developed something of a reputation for it, actually. Ms. Okafor, the teacher who never shortens or simplifies, a name without explicit permission. Last week, while shopping for school supplies for my 3rd grade classroom, I had an encounter that brought everything full circle. I was comparing different sets of markers when I heard a familiar voice asking, a store clerk for help finding teacher planners. They should be in aisle 7, Mrs. Peterson, the young employee replied. I froze, that name instantly transporting me back to that classroom 15 years ago. Surely it couldn't be the same person. And yet, when I glanced down the aisle, I recognized her immediately. Her auburn hair had gray streaks now, and her posture wasn't quite as rigid, but there was no mistaking my former 8th grade teacher. For a moment, I considered simply finishing my shopping and leaving without saying hello. Our paths had crossed once, significantly, but there was no reason to assume she would remember me or that conversation now. But curiosity got the better of me. I gathered my items and made my way to aisle 7, where Mrs. Peterson was examining a floral-patterned planner with a frown. "These are all so generic," she muttered to herself. "The academic ones are usually better," I offered, stopping beside her. "They have more planning space for lesson objectives." She looked up, her expression polite but blank. "Oh, thank you. I'll check those instead." "They're usually near the calendars," I added, then took a breath. "It's good to see you again, Mrs. Peterson. I'm not sure if you remember me. Adais Okafor. I was in your 8th grade class about 15 years ago." Her eyes widened in recognition, the planner momentarily forgotten in her hands. "Adais Okafor," she repeated, pronouncing my name perfectly. "Of course I remember you. How could I forget?" I smiled, genuinely touched that she remembered. "I'm a teacher now, too. 3rd grade at Lakeside Elementary." "A teacher? How wonderful." Her expression softened. And how fitting, somehow. We stood in awkward silence for a moment before she spoke again, her voice quieter. "You know, I often think about that day. Your grandfather's speech, your courage in speaking up. It changed how I approach my students' names, their identities." "I'm glad to hear that," I said sincerely. She sighed, looking down at the planner in her hands. "Actually, I'm not Mrs. Peterson anymore. I got divorced 3 years ago, and I've been thinking about going back to my original name, Pietra Zakowski." She pronounced it with a hint of uncertainty, as if relearning it herself. "But at my age, with retirement just around the corner, I keep putting it off. Change is harder when you're older." I noticed then how tired she looked, not just the normal end-of-summer fatigue all teachers feel, but a deeper weariness. The store's fluorescent lighting accentuated the lines around her eyes and mouth, and her shoulders curved slightly inward. "I don't think it's ever too late to reclaim something important to you," I said gently. "My grandfather always said that names are bridges, not just labels. Maybe yours could be a bridge back to a part of yourself?" She looked at me with surprise, perhaps hearing an echo of the wisdom her 14-year-old student had once reflected back to her. "Your grandfather, is he still—" "Yes," I smiled, "still teaching part-time at the community college, still, telling everyone who will listen about the importance of knowing your history." "A remarkable man," she nodded. "You were fortunate to have him." "I still am," I agreed. Then, making a split-second decision, I added, "Actually, I'm meeting him for coffee at Riverside Cafe in about an hour. Would you like to join us? I know he'd be delighted to see you." The invitation clearly surprised her. "Oh, I wouldn't want to impose on your family time." "It's not an imposition at all. My grandfather loves reconnecting with people from my school days." I hesitated, then added, "And it might be nice to talk to someone who's navigated name changes from both directions. If you're really considering going back to Pietra Zakowski, I mean. Mrs. Peterson, or Ms. Pietra Zakowski, as she might become, seemed to consider this for a moment. Then her expression lightened, as if a decision had been made. "I'd like that, very much, Adais. Thank you." As we continued shopping, then made our way to separate registers, I found myself reflecting on the strange symmetry of our encounter. 15 years ago, this woman had tried to simplify my name for her convenience. Today I was encouraging her to reclaim the complexity of her own. Life has a peculiar way of bringing things full circle, I thought. Sometimes the lessons we teach return to us when we most need to learn them ourselves. At the cafe later, watching My grandfather and my former teacher deep in conversation about the power of names across cultures, I felt a profound sense of completion. Mrs. Peterson, who had asked us both to call her Barbara for now, while I figure things out, was taking notes as my grandfather told her about Polish naming traditions he'd researched, just for this impromptu meeting. Names are living things, he was saying, his hands animated as they always were when he taught. They grow with us, change meaning over time, gather stories like moss on stones. Barbara nodded thoughtfully. I let mine go too easily, I think, out of fear of being difficult. It is never too late to reclaim what is yours, my grandfather assured her, the same words he had spoken to me countless times throughout my life. As I sipped my coffee, I wondered how many other conversations like this were happening across the country. People wrestling with their identities, finding courage in unexpected places, making peace with the choices that shape them. It reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place, to create spaces where everyone's full self could be recognized and honored. If you've ever struggled with having your name mispronounced or been asked to change a fundamental part of who you are, for someone else's convenience, I hope this story resonates with you. There's power in standing firm, in gently insisting on the space you deserve. And sometimes the people who initially resist making room for you might be fighting their own battles with identity and belonging. I'd love to hear your stories. How would you have responded in my situation? Have you ever had to defend your name or another aspect of your identity? Share this with someone whose name you've made an effort to pronounce correctly, or someone who's stood up for you when it mattered. Our names and our stories connect us, all 6,200 words of them.